Hi everyone, and thanks a lot for joining me back. We will start the lesson by talking about the layers. What types of layers, and what are the differences between them? Let's turn the layers back on. In After Effects, there are several types of layers. For example, this is a layer of an Illustrator file. This is a layer that is a text layer. This layer is a shape layer. And this layer is an MP4 file. Each layer has unique properties, but they also have identical properties. If I open the properties of all the layers, we will see that they all have transform properties. This means that all layers have the same basic parameters. Parameters such as position, rotation, opacity, and scale. All these parameters have shortcuts, which will be learned during the lesson. I will press Ctrl-Z several times. The same basic transform properties also exist in the text layer. But as I said before, each layer also has its unique properties. For example, a text type layer will have additional properties with parameters that do not exist in the Illustrator layer. Shape type layers also have their own unique thing. And that's what we'll talk about now. I will isolate our shape layer so that we can better understand what I am going to explain. So the shape we created earlier has some transform properties. There are the transform properties of the layer itself, and there are the basic parameters such as position, opacity, etc. If I open the contents, we will see that we have several shapes here. This is a shape that I probably created by mistake. And we have another shape which is an ellipse that we see here. Notice that when I select the ellipse, its marking here looks different from that of the layer itself. That way we can know if we are now messing with the content itself or messing with the layer in general. If you also have an unnecessary shape here that you accidentally created like me, just delete it. I will delete mine and explain this topic in more depth. So as we learned before, if I select this layer, and then select the shape tool to create a shape, then the shape will be created inside the layer. I will select the layer again and create the polygon. We will see that this layer has 3 contents. If I now move the layer's position parameter, all the shapes will move together. But I can also move each content separately. I'll close these layers so they don't disturb us. So as you can see, there are additional transform properties for the ellipse itself. Similar to the transforms of the layer. If I change the opacity of the whole layer, then all the shapes in it will turn off and on. But if I change the opacity of only the ellipse, only it will turn off and on. Same with the rectangle. This is something important to remember and understand. I'll delete those 2 shapes real quick. What is most important for you to understand is that in a shape type layer, there are parameters of the layer, and there are additional parameters of the content inside this layer. Because we only have one shape here, in our case we will not use the parameters of the ellipse, we can use the parameters of the layer itself. Now let's move our shape layer and create our first animation. But before that, let's change the name of the layer using the Enter key to .1. And now, so that the other layers don't bother us, we'll hide these layers with the Shy button. So I see that it's already selected as a Shy layer. I won't select this layer because I need it now. I will select those. And now all I have to do is click here. we will create an animation for the position parameter. But how can we know which property can be animated and what not? Every property with a time watch icon can be animated. This means that if we see this icon, we will know that we can create keyframes for that specific value and animate it. And now, I don't really need to see the rest of the parameters, so I will select the layer and press the P key. This is the shortcut for opening the position parameter. Now I only see the position parameter. If I press S, then I will only see the scale parameter. For opacity, I click on T. Why T and not O? T comes from the word transparency. For rotation, I will press R. In my case, I want to animate the position parameter. Let's do it together. Make sure that anchor point is centered. Those who don't have it in the center can take the anchor point tool and place the anchor point in the center of the shape while holding the Control key. Let's change here to a square, just for no reason, it just bothered my eye. Of course, I don't forget to go back to Selection Tools so I can move my layers. Let's click the apostrophe key to get the grid out. I told you we'd be using it a lot. Alright, so let's grab our shape and move it in the composition space, while holding the Shift key, so the movement will be on a straight axis, like that. So, now hold Shift and move the shape here. And now I want my shape to move from side to side. For it to move the way I want, first I need to decide when the animation begins, and how long it will take the dot to move from one point to another. And second, I need to change the value of the position parameter for it to happen. Right now, this dot is in a certain place in the composition whose position value is -72. So I decided that the animation of this shape would last for 1 second, and for an animation to be created, I need to tell After Effects that at second 0, this shape will be here at this value, so I will create a keyframe of this value. Now I will move my time indicator to the second one. Here I will tell After Effects when we reach 1 second, the shape should be here. So I'll just grab the shape and place it where I want. As you noticed, another keyframe was automatically created as soon as I moved the dot. So now I have 2 keyframes. Both have different values in the position parameter. This means that now After Effects knows that at second 0, the shape will be at this value, this position. And in the second one, because we changed the value of a position parameter when we moved the layer's position, After Effects knew that in 1 second it should move that layer to the new value, which is that position. Let's press space and see what it looks like. Great, we've created our first animation. Now let's try to understand a little more what we just did. So in our case, we gave After Effects 2 main points, 2 keyframes, and the in-betweens After Effects complete automatically. This is basically the difference between traditional animation and digital animation. Our shape will complete the animation after it has passed 24 frames. Why 24 frames? Because at the beginning when we created the composition, we chose that it would consist of 24 frames per second. That is, to complete 1 second of animation, the shape needs to go through 24 frames. And because we created an animation of exactly 1 second, the shape dot go through 24 frames until it reached its last point. As you can see, the dot starts moving immediately when I press the spacebar. Let's learn how to control the keyframes we created. Let's see what happens if I move the 2 keyframes here. The movement of the shape now started from the second 4, because that is where its first keyframe stands. This means that this keyframe's value is the value for this entire part of the timeline. If there are no keyframes before, then in terms of After Effects, the dot will stand here at this value. If I move the keyframes here, there will be no movement during this time. I will press space and the dot will not move until the 6th second. But why does the shape start moving after this point? This is because there is a new keyframe with a different value than the value of the keyframe before it. At this point, these were the values of the parameter, and in this keyframe, the values are changed. Let's bring the keyframes to the beginning and see what happens to our shape after it passes the second keyframe. The shape just stands still. Why is it stopped? For the same reason as before. Because there is no keyframe after it. That is, there is no change in the value of the position parameter. Now I want to show you how we make our shape move more slowly. Right now the dot is coming from the first point to the second, in 1 second. Let's see what happens if I take the last keyframe and place it here in the second 3. We will have more in-betweens, and if I move to the second 4, then there will be more in-betweens. The dot will now reach its second keyframe in 4 seconds and not in 1 second, like before. Therefore his movement will be slower. If I want the dot to reach the last point in 10 seconds, I'll take the keyframe and move it here. Now the dot moves really slowly until it reaches the last point. From here we understand that the distance between the keyframes affects the speed of the object I'm animating. If I move the keyframe back to second 1, the dot will move faster. So we learned how to control the speed of the animation. And now, let's learn how to make a pause in animation. Let's say that after the shape reaches its second point, I want it to reach this place here after a second. So I'll go to the second 2 and move the shape to where I want it. Let's press the spacebar and see what we got. It looks like the dot just continues its motion until it reaches a final point. But I want the dot to stop his motion for a while, and only then continue to move to the last point. I'll delete the keyframes real quick. So first of all I have to decide how long I want the shape to not move. Let's say I want this shape to stand still for a second without moving. I don't want any change in the values to happen, meaning I don't want a change in my keyframes. This means that this value should also be here. So I can copy the keyframe with this value, using Ctrl-C, and paste this keyframe by Ctrl-V, where the time indicator is located. So now when I move the time indicator, nothing will happen. It's because this keyframe and this keyframe are of the same value. And now I want the shape to reach outside the frame in the second 3. So from here to here, there is no change in the animation, which creates the pause. If I want a longer break, I'll take the last 2 keyframes and move here. And again, because these 2 keyframes are the same, there will be no change in animation. Now let's make the pause a little longer. So this and this are the same, therefore there will be no movement. Okay, so let's bring the 2 keyframes back here because I want the dot to stop for just 1 second. All this time, there is no change in the values. Now let's learn how to reposition all the animation we've done. So let's say, now I want the shape to do the same animation but from here above. From here to here. Let's see what happens if I just lift the shape. I created another keyframe I didn't want, and the shape didn't go the way I wanted. I ruined the animation. I will delete the keyframe and see how to do it right. If I want to change the position of the entire animation, it is not enough that I select the layer and move it. It will create a new keyframe for the location I bring it to. That's not what I want. I want all this animation up here. Let's see how to do it correctly. So first, I must stand on one of the keyframes with the time indicator. I'll press Shift when I move the time indicator so that it snaps to the keyframe. It doesn't matter what keyframe you stand on. Then I have to select all the keyframes manually, or I can click on the position parameter. And now I'm going to move it, holding the Shift key. And now the dot does the animation here from above, without the animation being damaged. What is important to remember here is that we have to stand on one of the keyframes while doing this. Because even if everything is selected and I don't stand up to one of the keyframes and move the layer, I won't be able to do what I want. Okay, so now let's move the shape back to its middle position. So we'll stand on one of the keyframes. Select all the keyframes here. Bring the grid to see the center. Then I'll grab the layer and move the layer wherever I want. I'll press Shift so that the movement is on a straight axis. And I'll place the shape here in the middle. And this is how we move layers that already have animation on them without damaging the animation. It is very important to remember this because it is a common mistake that happens. After you have made an animation, you will try to move the layer to another place. That way you will ruin the animation. So I remind you, to avoid hurting the animation, stand on one of the keyframes, select them all and only then, move them wherever you want. I will press Ctrl-Z. Now let's learn how to delete keyframes and what is important to know in this process. It is important to remember the order in which we delete the keyframes. I will explain. Let's say I want to delete the keyframes I made, and have the dot stand in the middle of the composition. Even though I'm standing here with the time indicator, and I see that the dot does stand in the middle, as soon as I delete these keyframes, the dot will jump to that position. This happened because the last keyframe that is left is a keyframe with this value. Therefore the dot will reach the value of this keyframe. And now you can also delete this keyframe, and then move the dot to the middle. A bit long way to delete the keyframes, and make the dot stand in the middle. Let's see how to do it correctly. I will press Ctrl-Z a few times. And now I can even stand here, after all the keyframes. Only this time I will delete the keyframes in such a way that the last keyframe that will remain is the keyframe with the dot standing in the middle. Remember, it was the keyframe with the dot standing in the middle. So I have to delete those two first, then this one. And finally the last one. And that's how we got the dot to be in the middle after the deletion of the keyframes. It may sound a bit complex, but it is not as complicated as it seems. Just remember that the order of deleting the keyframes affects some stuff, that's all. Alright, so now I want us to learn to animate layers in a slightly different way. The method we used to animate the dot now was the from the start to finish method. We created a keyframe from the beginning of the animation, and then brought the dot to its last point in the center. So we started animating from the start point of the animation to the end point. In After Effects there is another animation method called animating from the end to the beginning. I will explain. Let's say, I was told to move this dot from left to right in 1 second. So I know that the end point of the animation, the dot should be here in the center. What I do is, I don't get to the beginning of the animation to create the movement. I stand at the end of the animation, here in second 1. And I'll create a keyframe of this value. And now I'm going to go back in time and define for the dot that at this point in time, you have to stand here. I will see that it looks exactly the same animation as we created before. I'll delete the keyframes real quick. So the method I worked in it was from the end to the beginning. We work in this method when we know how the last frame should look. No matter what point in time the last frame will be, the main thing is to create the keyframe later in the timeline, not at the beginning. I will demonstrate again. For example, I can create a keyframe at second 6. Then reach the beginning of the timeline and place the dot here. Then if I press the spacebar, the animation will start from here to the middle. And if I'm not satisfied with the speed, I can just move the last keyframe closer. I want to remind you about the order of deleting the keyframes. If I delete this keyframe, the dot will be placed over here on the side. But if I delete the first keyframe, the keyframe I will be left with is when the dot is standing in the center. And now, let's implement the new animation method we learned together. And we will move the dot from the end to the beginning because we know that the last point the dot should be is right here, in the center. So let's stand with the time indicator at the second 1, and tell the dot to stand here. And at the second 0, we'll tell the dot to stand here. Let's see what we got. Excellent. And now I tell the dot until second 2, you won't move, so I can copy this keyframe from here to there, or I can click here. If I click here, a keyframe with the value the layer is currently in will be created. And now I'll move to second 3 and tell the dot come here. So here is our dot moving, making a small pause and continuing to move. And now, let's make this animation more interesting and add a scale animation during the pause. So we need to stand at this point, and now open the scale parameter. Let's press the S key, and create a keyframe, because at this point in time I want the dot to be this size. And now, I also want to see the keyframes of the position in order to synchronize the two animations. To display the position as well, we can select the layer and press the U key twice. Then we get all the parameters of the layer. But we don't need them all. So let's press U to close it back. And this time we press the U key once. That's how we can see only the parameters that have keyframes. So U once will display only those parameters that have keyframes, and U twice will display all the parameters that can be animated in this layer. So press U and get used to this shortcut because we use it all the time. So now let's go back to scaling the dot. And I'll tell it to grow at this point. I'll change the value of the scale parameter, and I'll use the opportunity to remind you that anywhere we can change values, we can write down a specific number ourselves. Let's write down 150. Okay, and now in the second 2, you'll be back to your original size. So I can copy the keyframe with this value, using Ctrl-C, and paste this keyframe by Ctrl-V, and the keyframe will be pasted where the time indicator is. If I want to scale it more, I can go to this keyframe and write down 200 or use this area as a calculator and write down +50. I remind you that wherever we can change values, we can also use it as a calculator. With those keys. Let's see what we got. As you can see, this whole animation happens for 3 seconds. Why 3 seconds? Because the first frame starts at second 0, and the last one is at second 3. And now I want to teach you how to control the speed of the animation when we have many keyframes, as in this case. So I can move the keyframes one by one, and try to maintain the ratio of the distance between them to maintain the same timing. And here, the animation lasts for a little more than 5 seconds, so the dot moves more slowly. So obviously this method is inconvenient, and takes a very long time. Let's see how to do it correctly. I will press Ctrl-Z a few times. We need to select all the keyframes and grab the last keyframe that is on the layer. It's not this keyframe, nor this one, nor that one. So after all the keyframes are selected, I'll hold Alt and move the last keyframe. And now all my keyframes move together while the gap between them is preserved. And here my animation looks slower. To return the duration of the animation to 3 seconds, I will stand with the time indicator at the second 3. Then again I will select all the keyframes, grab the last one and move the keyframes while holding Alt and Shift. Using Shift, the keyframes will be snapped to the time indicator's position. So that's the end of this lesson, and we'll meet in the next lesson where we'll continue to learn about the keyframes and how we can improve our animation. I highly recommend watching this lesson again because it is the most important lesson in any animation course. See you in the next one.